Able seaman Sam Cooke pulled himself aboard the destroyer HMS Decoy, exhausted, salt-crusted, and dripping seawater from his third rescue in less than 12 hours. Around him, other survivors from HMS Greyhound huddled on Decoy's deck, wrapped in blankets, some wounded, all traumatized by watching their ship torn apart by German dive bombers just 30 minutes earlier. What Cooke didn't know yet, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that his ordeal was far from over. In less than 4 hours, HMS Decoy herself would come under attack. He would go into the water again. And before this impossible day ended, Cooke would survive 3 separate ship sinkings, spend over 6 hours in the Mediterranean, and become one of the most statistically unlikely survival stories of World War II. The odds of surviving a single ship sinking were perhaps 50-50, depending on circumstances. The odds of surviving 2 sinkings in one day approached astronomical improbability. 3 sinkings in 12 hours defied calculation. It was survival that required not just luck, but resilience that bordered on superhuman. Most sailors who went into the water once were too exhausted, too traumatized, or too physically damaged to survive a second immersion. Going into the water a third time should have been fatal, but Sam Cooke refused to drown. His story is one of endurance beyond normal human limits, of psychological resilience in the face of repeated trauma, and of the thin line between survival and death that defined naval warfare in the Mediterranean during World War II's most desperate campaigns. The campaign, why Crete became a graveyard. The Battle of Crete in May 1941 represented one of the Royal Navy's most costly operations of the entire war. When German airborne forces launched Operation Mercury, the invasion of Crete, on May 20, 1941, the Royal Navy received orders to prevent German seaborne reinforcements from reaching the island while simultaneously evacuating Allied troops once it became clear the battle was lost. These orders were practically suicidal. The Royal Navy would be operating in waters dominated by German air power, without adequate air cover of their own, attempting to conduct complex naval operations under conditions of near-constant air attack. The Luftwaffe had established airfields on captured Greek islands and the Greek mainland, providing German aircraft with short flight times to Cretan waters and allowing continuous bomber presence over the operating area. Royal Navy commanders understood the risks. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean Fleet, expressed his assessment with characteristic bluntness. It takes 3 years to build a ship. It takes 3 centuries to build a tradition. The evacuation will continue. By May 22nd, the third day of intense naval operations around Crete, the Royal Navy had already suffered severe losses. The cruiser HMS Gloucester had been sunk. The destroyer HMS Juno had been bombed and sunk. The battleship HMS Warspite had been damaged by German bombs. Numerous other ships had been hit and damaged, with casualties mounting steadily. But the operations continued because thousands of Allied soldiers remained trapped on Crete, desperately needed evacuation, and would be killed or captured if the Royal Navy withdrew. So British destroyers, cruisers, and other vessels continued operating in waters that had become shooting galleries for German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Ju-88 medium bombers. This was the situation on the morning of May 22nd when able seaman Sam Cooke stood at his action station aboard HMS Kashmir, a K-class destroyer that had been built in 1939 and was now operating as part of Force D under Captain Lord Lewin Mountbatten, commanding from HMS Kelly. First sinking, HMS Kashmir goes down. At approximately 7:30 a.m. on May 22nd, Force D, consisting of destroyers HMS Kelly, HMS Kashmir, HMS Kipling, HMS Kelvin, and HMS Jackal, was steaming northwest of Crete, having just completed a nighttime sweep searching for German invasion barges attempting to reach the island. The force had been under near constant air attack since dawn. German bombers had been harassing the destroyers for over an hour, forcing the ships to maneuver violently to avoid bombs while maintaining their search pattern. Crews were exhausted from continuous action stations, lack of sleep, and the psychological stress of being under sustained air attack with no effective means of retaliation. At 7:55 a.m., a formation of 24 Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers appeared, approaching from high altitude. The Stuka was specifically designed for precision dive bombing. It would approach at altitude, roll into a near vertical dive, release its bomb at low altitude for maximum accuracy, then pull out just above the water. The distinctive scream of the Stuka's dive brakes, a sound deliberately engineered to terrorize those being attacked, announced the bomber's approach. HMS Kashmir's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the air with 4-inch shells and pom-pom rounds. But hitting aircraft in a dive required leading the target perfectly, and at the speeds involved, most shells missed. The Stukas concentrated their attack on Kashmir and Kelly, Mountbatten's flagship. Multiple bombs fell around both destroyers, creating massive water spouts that drenched the ships and rattled everyone aboard. But near misses weren't fatal. It took direct hits to sink warships. At 8 a.m., Kashmir took that fatal direct hit. A 500-kilogram bomb struck the destroyer amidships, penetrating the deck and detonating in or near the forward boiler room. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship's back was broken, literally. The bomb's detonation severed structural frames and compromised the keel. Kashmir began to fold in the middle, her bow and stern rising as the center section sagged. Sam Cook, at his action station on deck, felt the impact through the deck plates, a massive shock that threw men off their feet. Then came the sound of tortured metal as the ship's structure began to fail. Kashmir was breaking in half. The order, "Abandon ship," came within seconds. There was no time for organized evacuation. Kashmir was sinking so fast that men simply jumped, or were washed overboard as the sea rushed over the decks. The destroyer folded completely in half and sank in less than 2 minutes from the moment the bomb struck. Cook went into the water along with over 150 other survivors from Kashmir's crew of approximately 190. The Mediterranean in May was cold, but not lethally so, water temperature around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to cause hypothermia over hours, but survivable for considerable periods. But men in the water faced other threats. Fuel oil from ruptured tanks created slicks that made breathing difficult. Debris from the destroyed ship posed collision hazards, and the possibility of additional air attacks meant rescue ships might not be able to stop to pick up survivors. HMS Kipling and HMS Kelvin maneuvered to rescue Kashmir survivors, while HMS Jackal provided anti-aircraft cover. The process was agonizingly slow. Ships had to slow almost to a stop to allow survivors to climb aboard or be pulled up by lines, and while stopped, they were vulnerable to air attack. But the rescues continued because leaving men in the water was unthinkable. Cook was in the water for approximately 45 minutes before being pulled aboard HMS Kipling. He was exhausted, had swallowed fuel oil, and was suffering from shock, but he was alive. Approximately 140 survivors from Kashmir were rescued. 50 men went down with the ship or died in the water before rescue arrived. On Kipling's deck, wrapped in a blanket and trying to recover from his ordeal, Cook likely believed the worst was over. He had survived one sinking, terrible but survivable. Rescue ships would take the survivors to Alexandria or another port. Medical treatment, rest, reassignment to another ship eventually. This was how things worked. He had no way of knowing that his day was just beginning. HMS Kelly. Mountbatten's flagship goes down. While Kashmir's survivors were being rescued, HMS Kelly, Captain Lord Louis Mountbatten's flagship, was fighting for her life against continuing Stuka attacks. Kelly had already survived one near miss that had caused damage but kept her operational. But the Stukas were persistent, and eventually their numbers and determination would tell. At 8:03 a.m., just 3 minutes after Kashmir sank, a Stuka dive bomber achieved a direct hit on Kelly. The 500-kilogram bomb struck Kelly's port side at a shallow angle, penetrating the hull and detonating inside the ship. The explosion tore a massive hole in Kelly's side, destroyed her port engine room, and caused immediate catastrophic flooding. Kelly began listing heavily to port. Mountbatten from the bridge immediately recognized the ship was doomed. The list increased rapidly, 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. When a warship lists beyond 30 degrees, capsizing becomes inevitable. Water entering through the bomb damage was accumulating on the low side, creating progressive flooding that accelerated the list in a deadly feedback loop. At 8:13 a.m., 10 minutes after the bomb hit, Kelly rolled completely onto her side, hung suspended for a moment with her hull fully exposed, then capsized and sank. From bomb impact to final sinking took just 10 minutes. Over 200 men were in the water, including Captain Mountbatten himself, but Sam Cooke was not among them. He was aboard HMS Kipling, watching in horror as Kelly, the flagship of the force, capsized and sank barely a mile away. Kipling immediately steamed toward the new mass of survivors, adding Kelly's crew to the Kashmir survivors already crowding her decks. Kipling's captain faced an agonizing dilemma. His ship was now overcrowded with survivors from 2 destroyers. More Stuka attacks were coming. The German bombers were still circling overhead, looking for new targets. Every minute Kipling spent rescuing survivors made her more vulnerable. But men were dying in the water, and Royal Navy tradition demanded that rescues continue as long as physically possible. Kipling continued pulling survivors aboard while maneuvering to avoid bombs. The ship's crew worked with desperate speed, hauling exhausted men up the destroyer's sides, dragging them aboard, and moving them below to make room for more. Captain Mountbatten was among those rescued, pulled aboard Kipling, soaking wet and covered in fuel oil, but alive and still commanding. Of Kelly's crew of approximately 240, roughly 130 survived and were rescued. Over 100 went down with the ship or died in the water. Combined with Kashmir's casualties, Force D had lost approximately 150 men in 15 minutes. Sam Cooke, watching from Kipling's deck as Kelly's survivors were pulled aboard, understood with terrible clarity that he was lucky to be on the rescuing ship rather than in the water again. But that understanding was about to change. Interlude: the psychological impact. Before describing Cooke's third sinking, it's important to understand the psychological state of survivors at this point. Modern understanding of trauma, PTSD, and acute stress reactions didn't exist in 1941, but the physiological and psychological effects were just as real. Cooke had watched his ship break in half and sink in less than 2 minutes. He had spent 45 minutes in the water, swallowing fuel oil, uncertain whether he would be rescued before drowning or hypothermia killed him. He had just watched a second destroyer, the flagship of his force, capsize and sink, killing over 100 men. His body was in acute stress response. Adrenaline was flooding his system. His heart rate would have been elevated, his breathing rapid, his hands likely shaking from the combination of physical exhaustion, cold, and psychological shock. The fuel oil he had swallowed was causing nausea. His muscles were fatigued from swimming and the physical effort of staying afloat. Psychologically, he was experiencing what modern medicine would recognize as acute trauma response. The human mind has defense mechanisms against overwhelming experiences: dissociation, emotional numbing, hyperfocus on immediate survival tasks. Cooke's mind was likely in a state of hypervigilance, alert to every sound, every vibration of the deck beneath his feet, every change in the ship's motion. Survivors of ship sinkings describe a particular kind of terror, the knowledge that the metal deck beneath your feet, which seems so solid, can disappear in seconds, plunging you into water where survival depends on factors largely beyond your control. Once you've experienced one sinking, every sound, every alarm, every change in ship motion triggers the fear that it's happening again. Cooke was about to learn that his fear was justified. HMS Greyhound, third time into the water. At approximately 1:30 p.m., less than 6 hours after Kashmir sank, HMS Kipling encountered HMS Greyhound, another destroyer that had been operating in the area conducting anti-submarine sweeps. Greyhound was also overcrowded with survivors from other ships and had been under continuous air attack throughout the morning. Given Kipling's severely overcrowded condition and the continuing danger from air attack, the decision was made to transfer some survivors to other ships in the area to distribute the risk. If Kipling was hit and sank, all the survivors from both Kashmir and Kelly would be killed. Spreading survivors across multiple ships improved their chances of survival if any individual ship was hit. Sam Cooke was among the survivors transferred to HMS Greyhound. The transfer was conducted using boats and lines while both destroyers maintained some forward speed to maintain maneuverability. Cook went from one overcrowded destroyer to another, bringing with him the exhaustion, trauma, and fuel oil stains from his morning ordeal. Greyhound was a G-class destroyer, built in 1935, armed with four 4.7-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes. She had already survived several near misses from German bombs throughout the morning, and her crew was as exhausted as every other ship's crew in the area. Continuous action stations, constant maneuvering, and the psychological strain of being under sustained air attack with insufficient means to defend themselves. At 2 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after Cook came aboard, Greyhound came under attack from a large formation of Ju-88 medium bombers. Unlike the Stuka dive bombers that had sunk Kashmir and Kelly, the Ju-88s attacked from medium altitude using level bombing techniques. They would approach at 10,000 to 15,000 feet, calculate lead angles, and release bombs that would fall in patterns designed to bracket the target. Greyhound maneuvered violently, her captain ordering maximum rudder and speed changes to throw off the German bomb aimers' calculations. Near misses erupted around the destroyer, geysers of white water rising higher than the ship's mast. The concussion from near misses hammered the hull, rattling equipment and stunning anyone caught near the explosions. At 2:15 p.m., Greyhound's luck ran out. Multiple bombs struck the destroyer in quick succession. The first hit destroyed the forward gun mount and penetrated to the magazine. The resulting explosion was massive, the ship's own ammunition detonating from the bomb hit. The entire forward section of the destroyer was blown apart, killing everyone in the forward positions instantly. Additional bomb hits struck aft, destroying the engine room and starting uncontrollable fires. Greyhound was mortally wounded within seconds. The destroyer lost all power, lost steering, and was burning fiercely from multiple fires fed by ruptured fuel lines. The order to abandon ship came almost immediately. The ship was clearly sinking, fires were out of control, and there was no possibility of saving her. For the third time in less than 8 hours, Sam Cook heard the words, "Abandon ship." For the third time, he went over the side into the Mediterranean, but this time was different. This time, Cook was already exhausted from his previous ordeal. His body had not recovered from the physical exertion of the morning. His muscles were fatigued. His reserves of energy were depleted, and psychologically, experiencing a third sinking in one day pushed him into territory of trauma that few humans have ever experienced. Survivors later reported that Cook was visibly in shock after Greyhound was hit. The statistical impossibility of what was happening, 3 ships sunk 3 times in the water, was overwhelming. Some survivors of extreme trauma report experiencing a kind of surreal detachment, as if what's happening isn't quite real. Cook may have experienced this dissociation as he went into the water for the third time. Greyhound sank quickly, taking approximately 80 of her crew of 160 down with her, or leaving them dead in the water. The surviving destroyers, HMS Kandahar and HMS Kingston, rushed to rescue survivors, but the process was even more desperate than before. Greyhound had been carrying survivors from previous sinkings, and now those survivors were in the water again. HMS Decoy, a destroyer that had been operating nearby, also responded to Greyhound's distress. It was Decoy that pulled Sam Cook from the water for the third time. He had been swimming for approximately 35 minutes when Decoy's crew hauled him aboard. Cook was barely conscious. He had swallowed more fuel oil. His body temperature had dropped significantly. His muscles were cramping from exhaustion and cold. Medics aboard Decoy treated him for hypothermia, shock, and fuel oil ingestion. He was wrapped in blankets, given warm liquids when he could keep them down, and placed below decks where he could rest. But rest was relative. The air attacks continued throughout the afternoon. Decoy herself came under attack multiple times, requiring violent maneuvering that threw exhausted survivors around the interior spaces where they were sheltering. The psychological trauma of being aboard a ship under attack after surviving 3 sinkings was its own form of torture. Cook survived the rest of May 22nd aboard Decoy. The destroyer successfully evaded destruction despite multiple attacks and eventually made it to Alexandria with her load of survivors from multiple sunken ships. When Cook finally stepped off Decoy onto solid ground, he had survived an ordeal that defied probability, endurance, and psychological resilience. The statistical impossibility, calculating the odds. The odds of Sam Cooke's survival require some statistical analysis to fully appreciate. While precise calculations are impossible due to variables and circumstances, we can establish rough probabilities based on historical data from World War II naval combat. The survival rate for sailors when ships were sunk varied dramatically based on circumstances. Ships sunk quickly with little warning, 40 to 50% survival rate. Ships sunk with adequate time to abandon ship properly, 70 to 80% survival rate. Ships sunk in cold water far from rescue, 20 to 30% survival rate. Ships sunk in warm water with nearby rescue ships, 60 to 70% survival rate. For Kashmir's sinking, conditions were mixed. The ship sank quickly, poor for survival, but water temperature was moderate and rescue ships were nearby, good for survival. Estimated survival probability, 65%. For being transferred to Greyhound and surviving her sinking, we must consider that Cooke was already exhausted and traumatized. Physical exhaustion significantly reduces survival chances in water. Estimated survival probability for the second sinking in the same day, 40%. For surviving in the water a third time with cumulative exhaustion, hypothermia, and psychological trauma, survival probability drops dramatically. 20% might be generous. The compound probability of surviving all three sinkings, 0.65 times 0.40 times 0.20 equals 0.052, or roughly 5.2%. This suggests that Cooke's survival was approximately a 1 in 20 chance based purely on physical factors. But this doesn't account for psychological factors, the mental resilience required to keep fighting for survival despite repeated trauma, the willpower to keep swimming despite exhaustion, the ability to avoid panic despite overwhelming circumstances. Some survival studies suggest that psychological factors matter more than physical factors once basic physical survival is possible. The difference between survivors and non-survivors in extreme situations often comes down to the will to survive rather than physical capability. Cooke's psychological resilience, his refusal to give up despite experiencing 3 sinkings, may have been the decisive factor that kept him alive when probability suggested he should have died. The immediate aftermath, treatment and recovery. When Cooke arrived in Alexandria aboard HMS Decoy on May 23rd, he was immediately transferred to naval medical facilities for treatment. His condition was serious but not life-threatening. Primary concerns were hypothermia. Despite relatively warm water, Cooke had spent over 6 hours in the Mediterranean over the course of the day. His core body temperature had dropped significantly. Treatment involved gradual rewarming, warm fluids, and monitoring for complications. Fuel oil ingestion. Cooke had swallowed fuel oil during his time in the water. Fuel oil is toxic and can cause chemical pneumonia, gastrointestinal damage, and other serious complications. Treatment involved gastric lavage, stomach pumping, administration of activated charcoal to absorb remaining oil, and monitoring for respiratory complications. Physical exhaustion. The muscular fatigue from swimming and staying afloat for extended periods was severe. Rest, nutrition, and time were the primary treatments. Psychological trauma. In 1941, this was not well understood or treated systematically. Cooke was likely observed for signs of shell shock or combat fatigue, but the concept of PTSD wouldn't be formally recognized for another 40 years. The main treatment was rest, removal from combat stress, and the expectation that sailors would recover their nerve naturally. Cooke spent several weeks in Alexandria recovering before being reassigned to another ship. The Royal Navy, desperately short of trained personnel, couldn't afford to leave capable seamen in rear area positions for extended periods. As soon as Cooke was physically recovered, he would be expected to return to sea duty. The psychological impact of his experience would manifest in ways both obvious and subtle. Survivors of repeated near-death experiences often develop hypervigilance, anxiety around specific triggers, in Cooke's case likely air raid sirens and the sound of aircraft engines, and difficulty sleeping due to nightmares reliving the traumatic events. Some survivors develop survivor's guilt, questioning why they survived when shipmates died, feeling unworthy of survival, or experiencing depression related to feeling they should have done more to help others. Whether Cook experienced this is unknown, but it would be statistically likely given the number of men who died on the 3 ships he survived. The broader context: Crete's naval losses. Sam Cook's personal ordeal was part of a broader catastrophe for the Royal Navy during the Battle of Crete. The final accounting of naval losses during the campaign was staggering and represented one of the worst defeats in Royal Navy history. Ships sunk: 3 cruisers, HMS Gloucester, HMS Fiji, HMS Calcutta. 6 destroyers: HMS Kelly, HMS Kashmir, HMS Greyhound, HMS Imperial, HMS Hereward, HMS Juno. Ships damaged, requiring significant repairs: 3 battleships, HMS Warspite, HMS Barham, HMS Valiant. 1 aircraft carrier, HMS Formidable. 6 cruisers, HMS Naiad, HMS Carlisle, HMS Dido, HMS Orion, HMS Ajax, HMS Perth. 7 destroyers, various vessels with damage ranging from minor to severe. Personnel casualties: approximately 2,000 Royal Navy personnel killed. Thousands more wounded or suffering from exhaustion and trauma. The losses represented approximately 10% of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet destroyed and another 20% damaged in just 10 days of operations. The Battle of Crete demonstrated that naval forces operating without adequate air cover were extremely vulnerable to sustained air attack, a lesson that would influence naval doctrine for the remainder of the war. Admiral Cunningham, despite the losses, defended the decision to continue operations. It takes 3 years to build a ship. It takes 3 centuries to build a tradition. The evacuation of Allied troops from Crete continued despite the losses, ultimately rescuing approximately 18,000 soldiers who would have been killed or captured if the Royal Navy had withdrawn. But the cost was terrible. The Mediterranean fleet was so weakened by the Crete operations that it could not effectively contest subsequent German and Italian naval operations for months. The strategic balance in the Mediterranean shifted temporarily in favor of the Axis, the man who refused to drown. On May 22, 1941, as Sam Cook pulled himself aboard HMS Decoy for the 3rd time, exhausted beyond anything he had previously experienced, covered in fuel oil, shaking from cold and shock, he had accomplished something statistically improbable to the point of seeming impossible. He had survived 3 ship sinkings in less than 12 hours. He had spent over 6 hours total in the Mediterranean, spread across 3 separate immersions. He had experienced trauma that would have broken many people, and he was still alive. The ships that sank beneath him, HMS Kashmir, HMS Kelly, HMS Greyhound, rest on the Mediterranean seafloor with approximately 200 sailors who didn't make it off, didn't survive in the water, or weren't rescued before drowning or hypothermia killed them. Cook was alive because of a combination of physical fitness, swimming ability, psychological resilience, naval training, and luck. Remove any one of these factors and he likely would have been among the dead. His story never became famous. He was not awarded medals for surviving. His name appears in casualty lists and survivor records, but he never wrote memoirs or gave interviews that made his story widely known. He was simply one sailor among millions who served in World War II, who experienced extraordinary circumstances, and who survived through determination and chance. But his story deserves remembering because it represents the reality of naval warfare more honestly than dramatic battles and heroic last stands. It shows what survival required, not just once, but repeatedly. It demonstrates human capacity for endurance beyond normal limits, and it personalizes the statistics of war, reminding us that every casualty number represents an individual life, and every survivor carries forward experiences that shape the rest of their existence. 3 ships sank beneath Sam Cook on May 22, 1941. Over 200 of his fellow sailors died that day. He survived through a combination of capability and luck that defies easy calculation. And in surviving, he demonstrated something essential about human resilience, that the will to survive, combined with the physical and psychological capacity to endure, can overcome odds that seem insurmountable. The Mediterranean that day was a graveyard, 3 British destroyers joined dozens of other vessels already resting on the seafloor. But Sam Cook refused to become one more casualty in that graveyard. He went into the water 3 times, he came out 3 times, and in doing so he proved that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, determination and endurance can overcome even the most improbable circumstances. He was the sailor who refused to drown, and his survival stands as testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity.